Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be lifted.
The Senate is currently in session.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to laud the actions of the House of Representatives, which voted to repeal the class long-term care entitlement program that was created by the health care law. The vote yesterday in the House of Representatives was 267 in favor of repeal. It was a bipartisan vote. It was a clear, I think, message that this is a piece of legislation that needs to be taken off the books. And it was a disaster in the making from the very beginning, and many of us tried to predict that this ultimately program was destined to fail. And the House of Representatives vote yesterday to repeal this insolvent program, I hope, will pave the way for the Senate to follow suit, because my fear has been all along that if we don't get this program off the books, that at some point there will be an attempt to resurrect it. And that would be the absolute worst outcome and worst scenario for the American taxpayer, because this is a program that even before it was voted on and added to the health care bill was predicted would fail. The Congressional Budget Office said that it would run deficits in the out years. The actuary at the Health and Human Services Department predicted that this was a program that actuarially just was unsound, could not be viable in the long run. And it was just here in the last few months that finally the Secretary of the Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, came out and said that I don't see a viable path forward for class implementation. And that was a statement that she made back in the middle of October. And so even the person that was tasked with implementing this program has now said there is no viable path forward for class. And so we ought to get this off the books, Mr. President. It was, in fact, a pay-for in the health care bill. It was designed to help understate the cost of the health care bill. It front-end loaded premiums, got revenue in the door early, knowing full well that when the demands for payments came later on, that it was going to be upside down, and it was clearly a program that I think by any account all who observed this process closely knew just flat wouldn't work. But it was done. It obscured the cost of the health care bill, helped it to sort of balance out because it was front-end loaded, saw revenues come in the early years before the payments would have to go out in the out years. And so I'm hopeful that the United States Senate will take the action that was taken by the House of Representatives and to end this thing once and for all. Now, we got people on both sides of the aisle who have come to that conclusion. There was a lot of debate even in the run-up and the lead-up to the vote on the health care bill about how this wouldn't work. And I offered an amendment during the health care debate to strip it. We had 10 Democrats at the time who voted with me on that amendment, and many of them made statements regarding this legislation and the implications if it were to pass. In fact, the senator from North Dakota, the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, said at the time that this is a Ponzi scheme of the first order, the kind of thing that Bernie Madoff would have been proud of, and he vowed to block its inclusion in the Senate bill. Well, it ended up in the Senate bill. It ended up in the overall bill. And so to this day, it's still a part of the health care legislation, but a part that needs to be stripped out if we're going to do what's in the best interest of the American taxpayer and not put yet another unfunded liability on the backs of our children and grandchildren. So you've got a lot of bipartisan support for repealing it, a lot of people who have weighed in against this and know that it won't work. And you've got an awful lot of outside interest as well who have observed now that this is not something that is sustainable over time. In fact, a lot of editorial pages around the country, newspapers have weighed in on this. The Washington Post, a new gimmick that's been designed to pretend the health care reform is fully paid for, was something that they said back when this was being debated. The Wall Street Journal, known as the acronym CLASS, and I'm quoting, the long-term care insurance program for nursing homes and the like was grafted into the health care bill mostly to hide that bill's true costs. It has been described as a budgetary time bomb. And so it just seems to make perfect sense to me, Mr. President, and I hope to many of my colleagues, that we take the steps that are necessary to get this program off the books once and for all. It's going to somehow in trying to justify this. There are people who say, well, we ought to keep it on the books in case we figure out a way to go forward with it, to implement it. It just doesn't work. It can't work. And that's been known from the very outset. In fact, I want to mention just something else that the actuary at the Health and Human Services Department, Rick Foster, said, and this was prior to this thing again being voted on. He said, and this is a pretty powerful statement if you ask me, he said, 36 years of actuarial experience lead me to believe that this program would collapse in short order and require significant federal subsidies to continue. I want to repeat that. This is from the person who studies the trends and makes sure that these programs, or tries to make sure that these programs are actuarially sound. 36 years of actuarial experience lead me to believe that this program would collapse in short order and require significant federal subsidies to continue. That was the warning that was issued way before the vote ever occurred on the Class Act. You go back, he described it as a classic assessment spiral or insurance death spiral. Those are words, again, he used to describe this. The program is intended to be actuarially sound, but at first glance, this goal may not be possible. Those are all statements that were made by the actuary. And so, you know, those of us who were here at the time and were really concerned about this being included in the health care bill came to the floor, and as I said, I offered an amendment to strip it, came close to getting the necessary votes, but unfortunately fell a couple of votes short. But it had broad bipartisan support, but we recognized at the time that this thing was destined to fail. And now you've got all this stuff and the studies that have been done since that validate that by the objective sort of third-party validators, if you will, by the HHS actuary. So it seems to me, at least, Mr. President, that the American taxpayers, the American people deserve to know where their elected officials stand on the Class Act. Are they for keeping this unviable, insolvent, actuarially unsound provision in the health care bill, which now even those who are tasked with implementing it, the Health and Human Services Secretary Kathleen Sebelius has said there is no viable path forward for its implementation. Are we going to continue to keep this thing around, or are we going to have a vote here in the United States Senate to put the end to this thing once and for all? And I hope that the Majority Leader, Senator Reid, will allow us to get this up for a vote. It's been passed in the House of Representatives. It's very clear, based on not only all the actuarial evidence, but those who have looked at this, who are tasked with trying to put it into practice, that it's just not going to work. And so I would hope that before this thing goes any further, that we will get a vote here in the United States Senate that will echo what happened in the House of Representatives, and that we will do the right thing by the American taxpayer and get rid of a program that, if it ever is resurrected, if it ever is reincarnated in some form, could be a terrible, terrible drain on the American taxpayers, not only today but well into the future, and represent yet another unfunded liability that we will put on the backs of our children and grandchildren. It's time to end the Class Act once and for all. I'm going to continue to press for a vote on this, and I hope that Majority Leader Reid will allow us to get a vote on repeal of the Class Act so the American people do know exactly where their elected officials stand, and whether they're going to stand on the side of the taxpayer and stand on the side of common sense, or stand on the side of using this budgetary gimmick to understate the cost of the health care bill, and to perhaps at some point in the future put a plan in place that literally is not going to work and is only going to continue to lead us on a pathway to bankruptcy. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll. pretty clear at this point that there is broad bipartisan support for legislation that provides greater transparency in Congress. The more important question at this point is whether the executive branch is willing to play by the same rules. I mean, I think a lot of people out there want to know why a venture capitalist who raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for the president, only to end up overseeing the administration's green energy loan program, shouldn't be held to the same high standard as others. Shouldn't the president's chief of staff be held to the same standard as a legislative director to a freshman senator? Let's be honest, people are equally, if not more, concerned about the kind of cronyism they keep reading about over at the White House and within the executive branch agencies like the Department of Energy that it controls. Now, there's no question that Congress should be held to a high standard. But if we're going to pass new standards here, the same standards should apply to the White House and to the executive agencies that spend hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money at the president's direction. And that leads to a larger point, which is this. As long as the White House and the agencies it controls continue to play favorites, this economy will never fully recover and the playing field won't ever be level. As long as Washington has this much say over the direction of the economy, people won't ever feel like they're getting a fair shake. So yes, let's hold Congress to a high standard, but the White House must be held to the very same standard. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of quorum. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. The Senate should resume deliberation on the insider trading bill, the Stock Act, in about 5 minutes, 11 o'clock Eastern. Again, it's a bill that makes it illegal for members of Congress and their staff to trade on stocks, trade in stocks based on non-public information they garner from being members of Congress. We expect them to begin about 11 o'clock Eastern. The Congressional Quarterly writing today that the sponsor of the bill, Senator Joe Lieberman, and Majority Leader Harry Reid have expressed cautious optimism that obstacles could be resolved today. The Senate has not held votes on amendments to the measure, which they say formally reached the floor on January 31st. That's Monday when they agreed to move forward with the legislation. The House is in this morning, but just for general speeches. They'll be back at noon for a couple of bills that change the budgeting process in the House. Live coverage of the House is on C-SPAN, and we're covering also a number of budget-related hearings, two in particular, one with Doug Elmendorf, the head of the Congressional Budget Office, and that's live online now at cspan.org. The other with Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the Fed's budget outlook for 2012. That's live on C-SPAN 3. And also a hearing this morning that got underway at 9 o'clock Eastern with the Attorney General back before the Oversight Committee on the House, and he is testifying about the Justice Department's Fast and Furious operation that is underway, and we're also carrying that online at cspan.org.
know when 5 minutes
Action
has passed?
on speaking in morning business also.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. If you'd let me know when 5 minutes passed, I'd appreciate it. I'm trying to keep my comments short. The topic that I'd like to address is the Class Act repeal being taken up by the House. I understand that Labor HHS Secretary has indicated that from her point of view, the Class Act will not work, and this is music to my ears. During the Obama health care debate, one of the revenue raisers was the Class Act, where the federal government would be in the long-term health care insurance business, and supposedly would be collecting premiums over a decade. It would allow like $80-something billion in revenue that would help pay for Obama health care, but eventually you'd have to honor the payments due to people who are on the program, and Senator Conrad from North Dakota called the Class Act a Ponzi scheme of the first order, because what you would be doing under the program is collect premiums for an insurance product, use the money to help pay for Obama health care, and when the people who are ready to get their services that they have paid for, there'd be no money in the program to pay them because it's used to offset Obama health care costs, and it's just not a practical idea. The cost would explode over time. There'd be adverse selection. So it was an ill-conceived idea. The House is going to repeal it. The Labor HHS Secretary said that they would not implement the program. I hope the Senate will allow repeal so we could take it off the table. And it's a reason for the Congress to revisit the Affordable Health Care Act, Obama health care, because one of the components of the legislation relied upon the revenue to be collected by the Class Act to offset the cost of Obama health care, trying to make it revenue or deficit neutral. That is no longer a viable option. The money to be collected by the Class Act is never going to happen, so that money cannot be used to make the legislation deficit neutral. So this is a chance for the Senate, working with the House, to repeal the program, and I think it'd be wise for us all to sit down and try to reevaluate what does this mean in terms of the viability of the Affordable Health Care Act, because the assumptions made about the Class Act really are never going to come true. So I've been working with Senator Thune for a very long time to keep this program from coming about, and I would like to say this is a bipartisan moment where we've stopped a program that would have devastating effect long-term on the country's finances and would do very little to improve health care. So I want to, one, congratulate the Labor HHS Secretary for understanding this program is unsound, and I would like to make sure that it is repealed, and I think Congress should be the body to do that. But this is good news for the taxpayer. It's good news for the country as a whole that we're not going to allow a program to be created that's unsustainable, that's going to add to the debt and do very little to take care of our health care needs. It was a Ponzi scheme. It's a Ponzi scheme. It needs to be buried politically as soon as possible. So I look forward to taking up the House-passed legislation. I hope we could get bipartisan support in the Senate to make sure that what Labor Secretary Sebelius said never happens, that the Class Act never becomes reality, because it's an unsound, unwise, poorly constructed program. And this is a chance for the Senate to come together and do something about it with our House colleagues. And so with that, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
The quorum call continues, waiting for senators to come to the floor to speak. On the left-hand side of your screen, the Democratic side of the Senate, Joe Lieberman there, and Senator Durbin chatting. Senator Lieberman, the chairman of the Government Oversight Committee, who is moving this bill, the Stock Act, through the Senate. This is a bill that would make it illegal for members of Congress and their staff to trade on stocks based on non-public information. Expect a debate on amendments today, although there's no clear decision or agreement on how to move forward with votes on those amendments. The Congressional Quarterly writes this morning that many of the amendments circulating are relevant to congressional disclosure rules, and they say that senators have expressed concern about the possible overreach of the disclosure provisions in the bill and in related amendments. The Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell, just a short while ago spoke on the floor and again reiterated Republicans' call to make the bill applicable to the executive branch as well. The House is in today. They'll gavel back in at noon Eastern for legislative work, and several bills there dealing with the federal budget process. One would require the Congressional Budget Office to analyze the 40-year impact of major legislation. The Congressional Budget Office Director is testifying on Capitol Hill today. He is before the Senate Budget Committee. The hearing is underway, and you can follow that online at cspan.org, and it is, as a matter of fact, live now on C-SPAN up until when the House comes in. Also, more about the budget or the economic outlook with the Federal Reserve Chairman, Ben Bernanke, this morning testifying before the House Budget Committee. That's on C-SPAN 3.
Mr. President.
The senator from Connecticut is recognized.
I thank the chair. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I have 6 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders. I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank the chair, and I note the presence on the floor of the distinguished senator from Delaware, to whom I am pleased to yield.
Thank you, Senator Lieberman. Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware is recognized.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I rise to speak out on behalf of tens of thousands of Delawareans affected by domestic violence each year, as well as their families, their friends, and their allies across our state and across our country. Just a few minutes ago, my colleagues on the Senate Judiciary Committee took up the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. It has earned strong bipartisan support through the nearly 2 decades since its original passage, and it was voted out earlier today. Law enforcement agencies across this country are counting on us to move forward with the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, depending on the training and the resources to advocate for victims and to provide critical and life-saving interventions that it funds. As I asked for input from Delawareans in the last few weeks, one of the hundreds who took the time to write or call my office in strong support of the reauthorization of VAWA was a former Newcastle County police officer. He emailed me to tell me that he had seen firsthand that dedicated resources and innovative policing methods made possible by VAWA had made a real difference in combating these types of crimes and improving the lives of victims. The Violence Against Women Act, Mr. President, has been extraordinarily effective, with the annual incidence of domestic violence falling by more than 50% since it was first passed. Yet we still have so far to go. Just this week, I heard from hundreds of constituents in Delaware for whom this legislation has a deep and resounding importance, from young women in their 20s to senior citizens. Delawareans from all walks of life have reached out to ask us, as members of the Senate, to take action without delay, to work with our colleagues in the House, and to reauthorize this most important bill. I quote from Paul from York Lynn, Delaware, who wrote to say that as a father of 2 young daughters, he worries that if the Violence Against Women Act isn't reauthorized, then victims of sexual assault will once again be subject to 2 traumas. First, horrific attacks and second, trying to pursue justice against their attackers. Linda from Newcastle, Delaware, had the courage to write me personally and say, quote, "First of all, I am a victim, and I am not ashamed to say that today," unquote. Linda's willingness to lift the cloud of fear and shame that for so long enveloped victims of domestic and dating violence. First, it is brave and important that she was able and willing to do that, but she also highlights the ongoing challenges we face. She described her hesitation to discuss abuse out loud and stressed the importance of talking about these crimes in the open in order to break what she called the generational curse. As a son, as a husband, as a father, I too am deeply concerned about this curse that has moved from generation to generation and has affected families all throughout this country's history. Evils like domestic violence thrive in darkness. The Violence Against Women Act is a spotlight, and it deserves to be strengthened and sustained by this Senate today and this year. The Violence Against Women Act requires reauthorization every 5 years. This signifies a belief that protecting victims of domestic and dating violence is so important that we must revisit it to make sure we're getting it right. Each time we go through the process of reauthorizing this bill, we learn more about what's needed. And this time around, that process, I believe, has resulted in several critical enhancements. First, by bolstering the tools available to law enforcement. Along with my friend and colleague, Senator Blunt, I co-chair the Senate Law Enforcement Caucus, and I'm determined to ensure local agencies have the tools that they need to support victims and to prosecute abusers. This reauthorization will do just that. Second, our review made clear that perpetrators find their victims throughout our society without regard for sexual orientation or gender identity. And so the reauthorization that was passed out of the Judiciary Committee just earlier today addresses that challenge by making this the very first federal grant program to explicitly state grant recipients can't discriminate on the basis of a victim's status. Whether they are or not a member of the LGBT community should be irrelevant to whether they're able to access the vital services funded by VAWA. Finally, this reauthorization recognizes our current difficult fiscal situation as a country and promotes accountability to make sure these dollars are well spent. It reduces authorization levels while protecting the programs which have been most successful. This VAWA reauthorization merges 13 existing grant programs into 4 streamlined and consolidated programs. This will prevent wasted time and effort and make the application and administrative processes more efficient. I'm honored to be joined today in the gallery by an old and dear friend, a former countywide elected official, Paulette Moore, now Vice President of Public Policy for the National Network to End Domestic Violence. And I'm grateful to my dear friend Carol Post, who leads the Delaware Coalition to End Domestic Violence, and my friend Amy Barish, a tireless advocate in the ongoing efforts to bring to light the challenges of domestic violence in the state of New York. There are folks all across this country who turn to this task week in and week out. It is long and tiring and difficult work, but it is uplifting because it is part of making this a more just, more safe, and more secure nation. It is important for me to note, Mr. President, that unfortunately some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle see the enhancements I just referred to in this reauthorization as a reason to abandon their long-term support for it, even though they've been strong backers of VAWA in the past. In fact, the vote we just took in the Judiciary Committee was 10-8. It only narrowly passed. I hope that our friends on the other side of the aisle will review the details of these changes one more time and see their way clear to join us in this effort to strengthen and sustain the Violence Against Women Act. It is and should remain a bipartisan bill and a bipartisan effort. My predecessor in this seat, our great Vice President Joe Biden of Delaware, took an absolutely central leadership role in writing and passing the first Violence Against Women Act in one of the most enduring legacies of his 36-year Senate career, representing Delaware and advocating for women all over this country. His efforts broke barriers and laid the groundwork for this current bill, but it is up to all of us to keep pushing tirelessly for federal, state, and local governments to do more to save lives and to serve victims. I urge my colleagues to come together and promptly pass the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to the men and women of this country who worked so hard to end this terrible scourge of domestic violence in our country. I yield the floor. And, Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Thank you.